There's a strange thing that happens when you turn 60. It's not the body that changes first. It's not the hair. It's not the tiredness. It's not the mirror. It's something harder to name. It's the feeling that time, which before seemed elastic, suddenly begins to have texture, as if you could touch it, as if it became denser, more present, more honest. And it was precisely in this texture that I began to notice some things that I had never had the courage to look at head-on. I'm not going to tell this story as someone who discovered the answer. I'm going to tell it as someone who took too long to ask the right questions, and who, when I finally did, realized that a considerable part of my life had been lived on autopilot, repeating behaviors that were never truly mine, but that I had adopted so early that I could no longer distinguish where habit ended and choice began. This is not a story of regret. It's a story of recognition. Before we begin, if this type of story resonates with you, if you also feel that there are things within you that demand attention, but keep getting pushed aside, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always be able to follow along whenever a new narrative like this is shared here. These are simple human accounts, meant to be listened to calmly, perhaps when you need it most. I was 62 years old when my daughter told me on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon that I looked tired even when I was resting. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it with that gentle concern that children develop when they realize their parents have aged without warning. I was sitting on her porch, holding a cup of coffee that was already cold, looking out at the garden without seeing anything in particular. And she said, "Mom, you look tired even when you're resting." I smiled. I said I was fine. I said it was just the long weekend, the trip, the heat, but the phrase stuck. It lasted for days. It lasted for weeks. It lasted until the moment I stopped trying to explain it and simply began to acknowledge it as true. I was tired even when I was resting, and the problem wasn't physical. Let me tell you what my life was like before I understood what I'm about to share here. I used to wake up early. I've always woken up early for as long as I can remember. Not because I liked it, but because there was always something to do, someone to take care of, some need that required me before the day was over. I spent decades like that. Decades being the person who was available, the one who answered calls, the one who organized, the one who showed up, even when I hadn't been invited, because I knew I would be needed. This gave me a feeling that, for a long time, I confused with love. I confused it with belonging. I confused it with identity. If I was needed, I existed in a way that made sense. If someone needed me, I had a place in the world that no one could question. And so I built an entire life on this silent logic, the logic that being loved and being needed were the same thing. But they're not. And that was the first thing I needed to stop doing after 60, living to please others. I'm not talking about selfishness. I'm talking about something much more subtle and much harder to recognize. I'm talking about a way of existing that was built on the gaze of others, on approval, on gratitude, on the feeling of being indispensable. A way of existing that seems generous on the outside, but which inside is a silent negotiation. Elf, première Givmiselle, I remiriet. I had a friend, I'll call her Vera, with whom I lived for almost 30 years. Vera was the type of person who needed a lot. She needed attention, confirmation, constant presence. And I was always there. I cancelled plans. I rearranged weekends. I crossed the city in the rain when she called me. In crisis, and Vera's crises were frequent, varied, and absolutely real for her. I never felt bad about it. I never wondered if it was costing me anything. What I wondered, and this question embarrasses me a little now, was whether Vera loved me enough in return. Look at thee. I wasn't asking myself if that dynamic was doing me any good. I was asking myself if I was being sufficiently rewarded by it, as if the equation were valid as long as the balance was balanced. And when the balance didn't compensate, when Vera disappeared for weeks, or when she was too well off to need me, I felt a strange emptiness. An emptiness that I interpreted as longing, but which was actually something else. It was the absence of the feeling of being needed. It was the silence of my own usefulness. I didn't know at the time that I was confusing love with function. I spent my 50s convinced that this way of being was a virtue. I called it caring. I called it generosity. I called it character. And there were people in my life who confirmed this understanding, who told me that I was strong, dedicated, present. Beautiful words that I received with false humility. That humility which is actually disguised pride. But there was a cost that I hadn't accounted for. Each time I said yes when I wanted to say no, something inside me became a little quieter. Every time I rearranged my own life to fit into someone else's, a part of me remained waiting outside, like someone who is always about to enter but never actually does. Every time I chose to be needed instead of being honest, I distanced myself a little further from a version of myself that, deep down, I still recognized, a version that had opinions, preferences, desires, that knew what it wanted for dinner, what it wanted for vacation, what it wanted for life. This version has been going quiet, and I let it go. When my daughter said that phrase, "You look tired even when you're resting," what she was unknowingly naming was exactly that. It was the accumulated exhaustion of decades living in need of others. It was the silent weight of an identity built on external approval. She didn't know that. Neither did I, on that Wednesday afternoon with a cold cup of coffee in my hand. But there was something about those words that wouldn't leave me alone. And it was this, and is not an epiphany, not a dramatic turning point, but a simple, persistent discomfort that began to move me. I started paying attention to things that had always been there, but that I had never looked at carefully. I began to notice when I said yes out of habit, when I showed up out of obligation, when I made myself available out of fear of not being loved if I was absent. I noticed that it happened very often. I noticed that it happened almost every time. And I noticed that on the few occasions when I had said no kindly, without drama, just know the world hadn't ended. People hadn't abandoned me. Life hadn't fallen apart. But I had been breathing differently. There is a difference between being a caring person and being a person who fades into the background so that others can shine. It took me more than 60 years to understand this difference. Not because she was naive, not because she was weak, but because she had learned very early on at home, at school, in marriage, everywhere, that a woman who doesn't offer herself isn't a complete woman. That a person who puts herself first is selfish. That caring for others is the way to be loved. And when you learn something so early on, and that something is so constantly confirmed all around you, you don't question it. You just keep going. Until something, a phrase spoken on an ordinary afternoon, a coffee growing cold in your hand, a garden scene without really seeing makes you stop. And in the silence of that pause, you begin to hear something that has gone unheard for a long time, your own voice. But recognizing this was only the beginning, because there were other things I also needed to stop doing Things that were so ingrained in my daily life that they didn't even seem like behaviors, they simply seemed like reality. Things that my body had tried to tell me countless times in ways that I had ignored with impressive efficiency. And it was precisely this silence of the body, or rather, my ability not to hear it, that cost me more than I imagined. There is a language that the body speaks that is not made of words. It's made of weight, of tension, of a tiredness that appears for no apparent reason, of a pain that comes and goes without any exam being able to properly explain it, of a sadness that has no name, no identifiable cause. That is simply there on a Tuesday morning while you make coffee and listen to the noise of the street outside. I ignored this language for a long time. Not intentionally, not carelessly, but with that quiet competence that adult life demands, the competence to keep functioning, to maintain routine, to not let what's inside interrupt what's outside. He called it resilience. It took me a while to understand that it was something else. The second thing I needed to stop doing after 60 was ignoring my own signals. I'm not just talking about the body, although the body is part of this in a way that we often underestimate. I'm talking about a broader form of not listening the way I learned to push feelings aside, to normalize discomforts that shouldn't be normal, to treat my own internal signals as background noise, as something that needed to be managed so as not to get in the way. I remember a time when I was around 55 years old, when I would wake up every morning with a feeling I could only describe as a slight weight on my chest. It wasn't pain. It wasn't anguish. It was just weight, as if the day arrived already, burdened before it even began. I would get up, taka showe, make coffee, tidy the house, call someone, take off something, and the weight would stay. Sometimes it would lessen during the day. At night, when everything was quiet, it would return. I went to the doctor. He said everything was fine in the tests. He said it was stress. He told me to try to sleep better, drink less coffee, and go for walks. I did all of that. The weight continued. And so, since there was no clear medical cause, I made the most common and silent decision one makes in these situations. I decided it was normal. I decided it was life. I decided that everyone felt that way and that talking about it was an exaggeration. I continued. What I didn't understand at the time was that the body and emotions don't function like problems to be solved and then filed away. They function like conversations. And when you don't come to conversation long enough, it becomes more insistent. And if you continue to ignore her, she will eventually find a way to make herself heard that you can no longer choose to ignore. In my case, it happened in a way that wasn't dramatic, but it was absolutely clear. He had just turned 60. I was in a period that should have been easygoing. The children had their own lives. Work was at a more relaxed pace. Finally, there was the space I had always said I wanted. Space for myself, time for myself. That freedom that we dream of for decades and that, when it arrives, we sometimes don't know what to do with. And I didn't know. I stared at that space as if it were an empty room I didn't know how to furnish. There was stillness where there had once been urgency, and I discovered, with a discomfort that surprised me, that the urgency had served a purpose. It had kept me moving. It had filled the silence. Without her, the silence became too great. And within that silence, things that I had been putting off for years began to surface. It wasn't a crisis. It wasn't anything that required intervention or a clinical name. It was more like a tide that rises slowly, and suddenly you realize you're waist deep in water, and you don't know exactly when you got in. There was a sadness I had never truly processed regarding my marriage, not its end. Because the marriage had lasted, but certain versions of myself that I had buried within it. There were old resentments toward my mother that I had sworn were overcome, but which surfaced with disturbing clarity in dreams at times, in disproportionate reactions at others. There was a specific kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of never having been fully known by anyone, not even myself. Those things were there. They had always been there. I was the one who kept moving so I wouldn't have to see them. There's a very common misconception about ignoring one's own signals. People think that ignoring them is a form of strength. They believe that those who persevere despite exhaustion, sadness, and discomfort are resilient. People who don't give up. And part of that is true. There are times in life when continuing is necessary, when movement is what keeps a person standing. But there is a huge difference between consciously continuing, knowing what you are carrying, and continuing in denial, pretending the weight doesn't exist, treating your own feelings as inconveniences to be managed. I had practiced the second version with a dedication that, looking back, impresses me. He had developed a whole repertoire of ways to avoid feeling what he was feeling. Busyness was the main one. If I was always doing something, there was no room for discomfort to take hold. There was also relativization. There are people with much bigger problems. I have no right to complain. There was temporal comparison. I've been through worse. This is nothing. And there was, perhaps the most sophisticated of all, spiritualization, transforming suffering into learning even before truly experiencing it, wrapping the pain in a narrative of growth before giving it the chance to simply be pain. All of these strategies worked. In the short term, they worked very well. In the long run, they had a cost that I only realized when the space finally arrived and there was nowhere else to run. I remember one particular afternoon. Itwa winter. It was called Resisto do nothing. Not turn on the television, not pick up the phone, not start any pending tasks. Just sit and be quiet. I lasted less than 10 minutes. I got up, washed the dishes that were already washed, reorganized a drawer that didn't need reorganizing, and texted 2 of my children for no specific reason. It was only when I returned to my chair and realized what I had done, realized the complete automatic way I had escaped the silence that something within me began to understand. I was afraid of what was inside. Not a conscious fear, not a fear I could name and examine. A fear older than that, more diffuse, more ingrained, the fear that if I stopped moving, something that had been bottled up for a long time would overflow and I wouldn't know what to do with it. And then I kept moving, and he continued ignoring, and my body kept trying to tell me something, which I kept interpreting as noise. What changed wasn't a single event. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was something much more modest and much harder to describe. It was a specific kind of weariness from ignoring. There came a point when I was more exhausted from not feeling than I would be if I simply felt. That moment arrived on an ordinary morning, without any special circumstances. I was having coffee alone, listening to birds outside, and simply, I didn't have the energy to deviate. The weight that had been there for years arrived in a way. I couldn't manage. As usual, there wasn't enough urgency to get me moving. There wasn't a to-do list urgent enough. And then I stayed with him. I was left with the weight. I was left with the nameless sadness. I was left with the unanswered questions. I was left with the silence I had avoided for so long. And it didn't overflow. It wasn't devastating. It was simply a gift, like something that exists and, once recognized, no longer needs to shout to be heard. I gradually began to develop what I would call a different way of listening to myself. I'm not talking about intense introspection, diaries, or therapy, although those things can be profoundly useful for those who choose them. I'm talking about something simpler than that, starting to treat your own signals as information instead of interruption. Tiredness is not weakness. It's a given. Sadness is not an exaggeration. It's a given. The irritation that appears in specific contexts is not bad temper. It's a given. When you start reading your own signals as data instead of problems to be suppressed, something curious begins to happen. You become less reactive, not because you suppressed the reactions, but because you came to understand them before they accumulated to the point of exploding. I started sleeping better, not because I solved all my problems, but because I stopped carrying, while awake, the weight of everything that hadn't been allowed to exist during the day. I started having more honest conversations with myself first, and then with the people around me. Not dramatic conversations, no confessions or scenes, just more vérité, more honesty. And I began to notice that the weight of the morning, the one that had accompanied me for years, had become lighter. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it had become lighter, and that was a difference I could feel. But there were still other things that needed to be examined, because there were people in my life who, in a way, depended on me not listening to myself, who were used to a version of me that was always available, always absorbing, always present regardless of the cost. And when I started to change, even subtly, even in ways I could barely articulate, those people began to feel it. And I had to decide what to do with that. There is a type of relationship that doesn't hurt in a way that you can clearly identify. There are no frequent fights. There is no explicit cruelty. There is no specific moment you could point to and say, this is where things got bad. It's something more diffuse than that, more gradual, harder to name, and for that very reason, much harder to deal with. It's the relationship that simply drains it. It leaves you with less energy after each encounter than you had before. It makes you feel, consistently and inexplicably, a lightness when the person cancels and a subtle contraction when they confirm their attendance. It puts you in a position where you are always calculating, how much can I give? How much do I owe? How much can I still sustain? I've had relationships like that for decades. And the third thing I needed to stop doing after 60 was continuing in those habits without questioning them. I'll be honest about something that took me a while to admit. I was part of the problem, not because I was a victim of manipulative people, although some of them were indeed difficult in ways I only recognized too late, but because throughout my life, I had created a way of relating to others that invited that kind of dynamic. I was so used to being the person who offers, who absorbs, who holds on that people who needed someone like that naturally gravitated toward me, and I received them. Because being needed, as I've already said, gave me a feeling that I confused with love. The problem is that this feeling comes at a price, and that price is paid in ways that aren't always visible in the short term. I had a sister-in-law, I'll call her Sonia, with whom I lived for almost 25 years. Sonia was an intense person. She had strong opinions, a changeable mood, and a remarkable ability to make others feel responsible for her emotional state. When she was well, she was generous, fun, and present. When she wasn't very often. Her presence in the room had a weight that everyone felt, but no one named. Over time, I learned how to manage Sonia. I learned which topics to avoid. I learned the right tone to disagree without provoking. I learned when to introduce a light comment to ease tension. I learned to read her mood in the first 5 minutes of any date and adjust all my behavior accordingly. He called it sensitivity. He called it emotional maturity. Only much later did I realize that I called her that because I didn't want to use her real name. I had learned to diminish myself so that she wouldn't feel uncomfortable in my presence. And he had been doing this for 25 years. When I started paying attention, this different kind of listening that I had begun to develop. This way of treating my own signals as information, I began to notice patterns that had always been there, but that I had never brought together into a complete picture. I noticed that after family lunches where Sonia was present, I needed some alone time to recover. Not in a dramatic way, just silence. A walk, a moment of simply not being available to anyone, as if I had expended something that needed to be replenished. I noticed there was a group of old friends women I'd known for decades whose meetings left me feeling like I'd spent hours being subtly judged. Comments that were never aggressive enough to warrant a response, but that left a residue. A joke about my weight from someone who had always been thin. A question about my son phrased in a way that implied concern, but was actually comparison. A way of hearing my news that had the texture of tolerance rather than genuine interest. I had normalized all of that. It had become so normalized that I no longer understood it. It was just how things were. It was adult life. It was the price of long-term relationships. But when I started paying attention, I began to notice that not all relationships came at that price. There were other people, some I'd known for a long time, others more recently whose encounters left me feeling different, not necessarily euphoric, not necessarily memorable, just lighter, more whole, more like myself. With these people, I didn't need to calculate. I didn't need to manage my own behavior based on their moods. I didn't need to weigh every word before speaking. It could simply be. And the difference between these two types of presence, the one that depletes and the one that restores, became increasingly clear as I stopped ignoring what I felt after each encounter. The body knows. This is the kind of thing that seems simple when said like that, but in practice is extraordinarily difficult to take seriously, because it implies trusting your own perception in a world that has spent its whole life telling you not to be dramatic, not to be too sensitive, not to make a problem out of it. But the body knows. And when you start listening to it, you begin to get information that can't be obtained in any other way. The hardest part wasn't recognizing which relationships were draining me. The most difficult question was what to do with this recognition, because these people weren't enemies. They were, in some cases, of dates. They were people with whom I had lived real moments, with whom I had shared losses and joys, with whom I had built a common history that couldn't simply be erased. And then there was the weight of guilt, that inner voice that said, "Who am I to decide that a person drains me? Who am I to distance myself from someone who might need me? Isn't that selfishness? Isn't that exactly what I swore I wouldn't be?" That voice was old. It was much older than the relationships in question. It was the same voice that had taught me, decades ago, that putting one's own needs first was a character flaw. And I had to learn, slowly and with considerable resistance, to question that voice. I didn't make any dramatic decisions. There were no closure talks, no confrontations, no announced dismissals. What happened was a gradual change in how I positioned myself within each relationship. I started saying no in ways I would have avoided before. Not aggressively, not with long justifications, just no. I can't do it this time. I'd rather not get into that. I don't have the energy for that today. Small no's, discreet, almost invisible from the outside. Inside, they were vastly different from anything I had practiced before. And what happened was revealing, not because the reactions were dramatic, but because some were exactly what I had feared for decades. And yet the world didn't end. Senior was clearly upset in a situation where I didn't give in as usual. There was a cold silence, an abrupt departure, 2 days without contact, and then life went on. She went on. Première went-on. The relationship continued, differently, with a slightly altered balance that, over time, became more honest than it had been in years. Not because I had gained anything, but because I had stopped giving away what I didn't have to give. With the group of old friends, the process was slower and more melancholic. I didn't distance myself from everyone, but I started to realize who I really wanted to see frequently and who I saw out of habit, obligation, or fear of what the distance would mean for the friendship we thought we had. I started prioritizing quality over frequency. I began showing up less often to gatherings that cost me more than they gave me. And in that process, I discovered, with a mixture of sadness and relief, that some friendships were more fragile than I thought. That part of what sustained them was precisely my unconditional availability. And that when that availability diminished, interest diminished along with it. That hurt. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt. But there was also something clean in that pain. Something that told me I was finally seeing things as they were, instead of how I needed them to be. During this period, I learned the difference between a relationship that challenges and a relationship that depletes. Every real relationship is challenging. Every genuine relationship has moments of friction, disagreement, and effort. I'm not talking about seeking conflict-free relationships that doesn't exist and wouldn't be honest. I'm talking about a more subtle distinction, the difference between a relationship that challenges you to grow and a relationship that consistently diminishes you, between a relationship where discomfort eventually opens up to something deeper and a relationship where discomfort is simply the permanent state, never resolved, always renewed. When I started making this distinction, I also began to understand that acknowledging it wasn't abandonment. That limiting the access certain people have to me isn't rejection, it's honest management of my own energy. That a smaller, more authentic presence is worth more than a total, performative one. This didn't turn me into an isolated person. On the contrary, with less energy being drained in relationships that were costly, I became more present in the relationships that mattered. More truly available, not out of obligation, but out of genuine choice. And there was a huge difference between the two. But there was still something I hadn't touched. Something that lay in a place deeper than relationships, more intimate than any external dynamic. There were words I had never said before. Conversations that I had postponed for so long that part of me had begun to believe that the postponement was the decision. And these silent conversations, these unspoken things that live like debts within us, had a weight that no distancing from Sonia, no renegotiation of friendship could touch. Dewere mean only them. There are words that we hold on to for so long that they begin to become part of our inner architecture. These aren't just passing thoughts. They're structures, they're walls, they're things that become so ingrained in our way of being that we can no longer distinguish whether we're keeping them by choice or if we've simply forgotten they exist. I had some of those words. Some were pardons that were never spoken aloud. Others were truths I had swallowed in moments when speaking seemed too dangerous, too unnecessary, too late. There were also expressions of gratitude that I had assumed the other person knew because they seemed obvious, because the moment had passed, because somehow life went on without them needing to be uttered. And there was, perhaps the heaviest of all, an apology that I had postponed for years to a person who, when I finally decided I was ready to make it, was no longer here to receive it. The fourth thing I needed to stop doing after 60 was postponing important conversations. My mother died when I was 57 years old. It wasn't a sudden death. It was slow, as some deaths are a gradual decline that gives the family time to prepare, which in practice means the family is in limbo for months, knowing what's coming, without knowing exactly when, living in anticipation that is exhausting in a way different from the grief that follows. I was present during that period. I went to the doctors, organized the care, coordinated the sisters, did what needed to be done. I was useful, as I always had been, as I always knew how to be. What I didn't do, what I couldn't do, or didn't allow myself to do, the distinction isn't clear to me yet, was have a real conversation with her. Not about logistics. Not about medication or who would look after her on the weekend. A real conversation. About what had been difficult between us. About the ways she had hurt me without knowing it, and the ways I had distanced myself from her in response, also without naming them. About things I had admired in her and never said because it wasn't our way. About the fear I felt of losing her, which was disguised as efficiency, organization, and practical presence. There was a moment, a few months before the end, when she was lucid and quiet, on a Sunday afternoon, and I was sitting beside her bed, and there was a silence between us that was different from other silences, a silence that felt like a half-open door. I didn't go in, I stayed outside. I said I was going to get water. I came back with 2 glasses and we chatted about unimportant things until the moment passed. And that moment never came again. I carried this Sunday for a long time. Not like constant guilt, not like a wound that bled openly. More like a dull weight, the kind you learn to ignore most of the time, but which appears at specific moments with surprising clarity in a smell. On a similar Sunday afternoon, in a conversation with your own children, where you suddenly realize you're repeating the same pattern of not saying what matters. This burden taught me something that no other experience had taught me with the same clarity, that the time we assume we have is no guarantee of anything. I'm not saying this in an alarmist way. I'm not saying that death is always near, and that we therefore need to live in constant urgency. That would be exhausting and honestly false. Most important conversations can wait a day, a week, even a month. What can't wait indefinitely are those conversations that we know need to happen and keep postponing. Not because the time hasn't come, but because having that conversation requires a vulnerability that is frightening. These conversations, the ones that are held back not for lack of opportunity, but for lack of courage, are the ones that cost the most. After my mother left, I started paying attention to how many other conversations I had put off. There was one with my older brother, let's call him Roberto, about a situation from years ago where I had felt deeply overlooked by him in a family matter. It wasn't something that had prevented us from seeing each other at Sunday lunches, exchanging messages, or functioning like siblings on the surface of life. But there was a layer of distance between us that I knew stemmed from that, and that neither of us had ever named. There was a conversation I had never been able to finish with my husband, not about the marriage itself, which had found its own rhythm over time, but about a specific period, many years ago, when I had felt completely invisible in our life together. A time he probably barely remembered, and one that I had carefully preserved as a way of not letting go. And there were conversations with the children not of conflict, but of revelation. Things about myself that I had never shared with them because, in my mind, a mother doesn't burden her children with her own inner life. A mother is support, not a burden. A mother is okay, and I had pretended to be okay for too long. The first conversation I decided to have was with Roberto. It wasn't elaborately planned. I didn't sit down to prepare what I was going to say. I didn't rehearse versions. One afternoon, when we were alone after a family lunch, while the others were in other rooms, I simply said, "Roberto, there's something from years ago that I've never talked to you about, and that I think I should." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. But in those seconds, I felt everything that had prevented me from saying it. For years, the fear that he would become defensive, the fear that I would be perceived as resentful, the fear that the conversation would make real a problem that, as long as it remained unnamed, I could continue pretending didn't exist. Roberto listened. He didn't get defensive, although I could see he'd been caught off guard. He said a few things. He explained his perspective in a way I hadn't considered, because I'd been so preoccupied with my own version of events that I'd never genuinely asked myself what his was. The conversation lasted perhaps 20 minutes. It didn't solve everything. It didn't create a sudden cinematic closeness that erased decades of distance. But something changed. It was perceptible, as if a pressure that had been there for a long time had lessened enough for the two of us to breathe differently when we were near each other. The conversation with my husband was more difficult, not because he was resistant. On the contrary, he listened with an attention that moved me. It was more difficult because it implied admitting something I had worked so hard not to admit, that I had guarded that resentment so carefully that it had become, in a way, an object of value to me, that there was a part of me that didn't want to resolve it because resolving it meant giving up something, a narrative, a justification, a reason for the distance I had maintained within the marriage, even when everything was working well on the surface. When I realized this, when I said aloud, one Saturday afternoon in a shared kitchen, "I think I've kept this inside for so long that I don't know how to live without it anymore." It was like hearing a truth I had known for a long time, but had never allowed myself to fully articulate. My husband was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I also kept things." And we stayed there for a time I can't measure, talking about things we hadn't talked about in decades of marriage. Not dramatically, with that specific quietness that appears when two people finally decide to be honest and discover that honesty, although frightening, is much less burdensome than what had been carried in its place. With the children, it was different again. It wasn't a one-off conversation. It was a gradual process of allowing myself to be more real in their presence, of stopping answering "I'm fine" when I wasn't completely fine, of sharing, in modest doses, some of the things I had learned about myself during that period, not as a burden, not as a dramatic confession, but as simple honesty. And what I discovered in that process was something I hadn't expected. My children didn't need me to be perfect. They never had. They had grown up with an image of me that I had painstakingly constructed the mother who is okay, who knows what she's doing, who has all the answers, and that, by being slightly more humanized, didn't frighten them. On the contrary, one of them told me in one of those conversations that he felt relieved, that there was something about me being more real that made him feel he could also be more real with me, that there were things about him that he hadn't told me because he didn't want to worry me, and that now, perhaps, he could. This son is 32 years old. There were things about him that he hadn't told me because he didn't want to worry me. I kept thinking about it for days. How much real intimacy had been prevented by the effort I had made to appear invulnerable. How much genuine connection had remained outside the door I had kept closed to protect myself, a door that, by keeping closed, had also prevented the people I loved from truly entering. There's a phrase I heard once that has stuck with me, a kind of lasting impression few phrases have. I don't remember who said it. I don't remember the context. I only remember the words. The conversation you most fear having is usually the one you most need. I don't completely agree with that. There are conversations that should be chosen carefully. There are times when silence is the right answer, and there are situations where exposure serves no one. But there is a kernel of truth in that statement, which, at least as far as my own experience is concerned, has been confirmed time and again. The conversations I had postponed the most were the ones that carried the most weight. And the weight didn't lessen with postponement, it accumulated. And the accumulation didn't protect me from anything, it only guaranteed that when the subject finally came up, by choice or circumstance, it would arrive with decades of pent-up pressure that made everything more difficult than it needed to be. Learning to have conversations at the right time, not urgently, not impulsively, but without the systematic procrastination born of fear, was one of the most difficult and liberating things about this period. Because every conversation I had, no matter how small, gave me back a little bit of something I had surrendered to silence. It gave me back the feeling that I truly existed for the people I loved, not as a function, not as support, as a person. And it was precisely this feeling, that of existing as a person, with a history, with contradictions, with the possibility of change, that began to make me question something I had treated as an immutable fact for a long time. Zeideatat, after a similis, that habits are formed, that character is defined, that personality is fixed. That change, after 60 years, would be either impossible or neither properly inappropriate, as if there were an expiration date for the transformation. And I was about to discover that this idea was one of the most expensive purchases I had ever made in my life. There's a very kind lie that adult life tells us. It's not spoken aloud. It doesn't appear anywhere in writing, but it's gradually instilled through small phrases spoken by people who love us, through comments that seem practical but are actually limitations wrapped in common sense. The lie is this, that there is a point at which change is no longer possible, not as a declaration. No one openly says, "You're way past your prime." What's said is more subtle. It's, "You've always been like this." It's, "At our age, we already know how it is." It's, "Never mind. It's been so long." It's that slightly condescending smile that appears when someone older announces they're going to do something different, as if the novelty itself were a naivete that experience should have cured. I had believed that lie with a conviction that I only realize now, looking back. There was a set of habits I'd carried for decades that I'd never seriously questioned, not because they were good, but because they were mine. Because they were familiar. Because there was a strange comfort in the familiar, even when the familiar no longer served its purpose, even when there was clear evidence that it was costing me something real. The fifth thing I needed to stop doing after 60 was being afraid to change old habits. Let me tell you about sleep. For almost all of my adult life, I slept poorly. Not dramatically, it wasn't severe insomnia. There was no diagnosis, no sleepless nights. It was light, interrupted sleep, the kind of sleep that technically happens but doesn't restore. I would wake up tired with a consistency that had completely normalized. That was just how I slept. That was my sleep. I had tried things over the years, teas, hot baths, avoiding coffee after 3 in the afternoon. Things that worked for a week and then stopped working, confirming what I had already concluded, that it was simply like that. That some people sleep poorly, that I was one of those people. When I began the process, I'm describing this different kind of listening to myself. This examination of patterns that have always been there without being questioned sleep ended up on the list almost by accident. I started paying attention to what happened in the hours before I went to sleep, to what I was thinking, what I was watching, what I was taking to bed in terms of unfinished conversations, unresolved worries, mental lists of everything that needed to be done the next day. I realized there was a nightly anxiety ritual I practiced so consistently that I no longer perceived it as anxiety. It was just how I prepared myself for sleep, reviewing the day, projecting the next day, mentally checking if I had forgotten anything, worrying about things that couldn't be resolved at that moment in any way. And then I tried something different. Not an elaborate stop revising, stop planning, stop shaking. When the thought appeared, and it appeared insistently, I simply acknowledged it and didn't follow it. Not forcefully, but with repeated gentleness. This can wait until tomorrow. It took a few weeks for the pattern to change, but it changed. And when my sleep improved, when I started waking up with a feeling I barely recognized because I'd been absent from it for so long, I realized I'd been carrying that tiredness for decades, believing it was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. It was a habit. And habits, contrary to what the gentle lie had taught me, can be changed at any point in life. This discovery opened something up. It's the only way I can describe it. It opened something. Like when a window that's been closed for a long time is opened and the air that comes in has a quality you'd forgotten. I began examining other habits with the same curiosity I had used to examine sleep. Not with the intention of transforming everything at once, that would be exhausting and probably counterproductive, but with a genuine openness to questioning what I had assumed to be fixed. There was the way I ate, not in a problematic way, but with a monotony that had set in so gradually that I no longer noticed it. I ate the same things at the same times in the same way years ago, not because they were necessarily the best choices, but because they were familiar. Change implied making decisions, experimenting, eventually making mistakes, and there was a resistance to this process within me that I had disguised as preference. There was the way I used my free time, that space that had appeared after the children grew up and work slowed down. That empty room I hadn't known how to furnish. I had filled it with things that occupied my time without necessarily nourishing me. Television I wasn't really watching. Social media scrolled through without intention. Household chores done not because they were necessary, but because they gave the feeling of doing something. There was the way I moved through the world physically, or rather, how I had stopped moving. The walking that had been regular for years and that had disappeared from my routine so gradually that I had barely noticed. The body that had become more static, not out of limitation, but out of habit and stasis. In each of these cases, there was the same structure, something that had worked in a certain way at some point in my life that had remained, that had calcified into routine, and that I had stopped questioning, not because it still served its purpose, but because questioning required an energy that seemed excessive for something that wasn't that important. What I realized throughout this process is that resistance to changing habits rarely has to do with the habit itself. It has to do with identity. When a habit has existed long enough, it ceases to be something you do and becomes something you are. And questioning the habit becomes, on a deeper level, questioning identity. As if changing the way you sleep implies questioning the person who has always slept that way. As if altering what you eat implies questioning the person who has always eaten that way. And questioning one's identity after decades, after one's self-image, is so consolidated that it seems like a fact and not a construct, is one of the most disturbing and liberating things there is. Disturbing because it implies admitting that much of what we assume to be a way of being is a way of having become. Liberating because if it's a way of staying, it can be a way of leaving. I started walking again. It seems small. Maybe it is small. But what happened when I started moving my body regularly again was something I hadn't anticipated, not just physically. Although there was a difference physically as well. What happened was that I started having time every day that was just for me. Not dedicated to anyone, not serving any task, not filled with any obligation. Just me, the path, what was around me. And during that time, thoughts that had been held back found a way to organize themselves. Things that I had avoided thinking about directly came to the surface, as they demandent only to exist. It was during these walks that many of the perceptions I'm describing here solidified, not as illuminations, not as dramatic insights, as gradual clarifications, like a mist that slowly lifts. It was on one of those walks that I began to understand the most important thing in this whole process. The thing that was beneath all other things. The route from which all these behaviors branched out. There was a question I had never asked directly, but it was present in everything I had described so far. Why had I lived for so long in ways that clearly didn't serve me? Why had I continued to erase myself, ignore my own signals, maintain relationships that drained me, hold back words, ressichant vivenu, en somme level that other existed? The answer didn't come all at once. But when it arrived with a clarity that left no room for dispute. I had spent my entire life trying to prove something, not consciously, not with that clear formulation in mind, but in practice, in the structure of each choice, there was always, somewhere, that attempt to prove that I was good enough, that I was needed enough, that I deserved the space I occupied, that there was justification for my presence in the world, not just to exist, but to exist in a way that was validated by usefulness, by approval, by the need that others had for me. This need to prove oneself had shaped entire decades. He had made me say yes when I wanted to say no, because saying no could imply that I wasn't generous enough. I had been forced to ignore my own tiredness, because acknowledging tiredness would mean admitting a limit, and limit seemed incompatible with the version of myself that needed to exist in order to be enough. I had been forced to maintain relationships that drained me because ending or limiting those relationships could make me seem selfish. And being selfish was incompatible with the identity I had constructed as proof of worth. I had been made to hold back words because the vulnerability that important words demand would be an exposure that the need to appear strong wouldn't allow. It had made me resist change because changing implied admitting that the previous way hadn't worked completely, and admitting that would, in a way, be an admission of failure. Everything connected, everything coming from the same source. The silent belief that I needed to prove I deserved to be here. And then came the sixth thing, the last one, the one that contains all the others, the things I had neglected in ways that I can now see with a clarity that sometimes still moves me. My own autonomy. Not autonomy in the practical sense. I had made decisions, managed my life, and made choices that were technically mine. I'm talking about autonomy in a more fundamental sense. The capacity to exist as a starting point rather than an answer. To make choices based on what I want, what I need, what makes sense to me, not based on what will be approved, what will be necessary, what will confirm that I am sufficient. The autonomy of simply being, without that being needing to be justified, proven, or wrapped in usefulness to deserve space. This autonomy was something I had neglected. Not because no one had taken it from me, no one had. I had given it away, voluntarily, little by little, in transactions so small and so frequent that it had never seemed like a meaningful surrender. I had given it away in every yes that wasn't mine, in every ignored need, in every word kept to myself, in every avoided change, in every relationship sustained beyond the point I would have chosen to sustain it if the choice had been genuinely mine. When I stopped trying to prove myself, when that specific exhaustion, the exhaustion of decades of needing validation, finally reached the point where there was no more energy left to sustain it, what I discovered on the other side was not emptiness. It was still, and in the silence, a feeling that took me a while to identify because it wasn't familiar enough. It was freedom, not freedom in the grandiose sense, not a visible transformation from the outside, not an unrecognizable life. The small, concrete freedom of waking up in the morning and asking what I want, not what would be most useful, not what would be most approved, not what would prove something, but simply what I want. To say no without providing a justification, saying yes without calculating the return, being present in relationships because I choose to be, not because I fear what might happen if I'm not. To change habits without having to defend the change. I have conversations because things need to be said, not because I'm ready. Not because the timing is perfect, but because postponing them costs more than any discomfort the conversation might bring. Listen to your own body and treat what it says as truth. To exist without the constant burden of needing to prove that this existence is legitimate. 60 years is a long time to carry something that was never truly yours. I'm not saying it was wasted time. It wasn't. Each phase had its purpose, taught what it taught, and was necessary in the way things are necessary when you don't yet know what you're carrying. But there's something I wish I had understood sooner, not to spare myself the journey, but to have gone through it with more ease, with less unnecessary resistance, with more real presence in moments when I was only managing the surface of things. that I was already enough, that there was nothing to prove. The love I had sought outside myself in the approval, usefulness, and neediness of others was available in a much more direct, simpler, and more sustainable way in the relationship I had neglected in ways I can now name. My relationship with myself. I don't know how your life is now. I don't know what things you're carrying, what conversations are being kept inside, what habits are calcified into identity, what relationships are being sustained beyond the point where they make sense. I don't know if you recognized anything I've said here, and if you didn't, that's okay. Every life has its own rhythm, its own language, its own way of reaching the things that need to be reached. But if any part of this resonated with you, if there was a moment when you felt something you recognized in what I described, perhaps it's worth paying attention to that recognition. Not as an emergency, not as just another thing to solve, another list to complete, another test to pass. For your information, like the body weight words, like a half-open door that doesn't need to be crossed right now. But it's there, you know it's there, and knowing that is already a way to begin. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've ever experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching it from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing that you're not alone.